Hi everyone! Thanks for joining me today at React Brussels for my talk where we're going to build an internationalized React application. My name is Daria Caraway. I am a senior UI engineer at Netflix where I get to build some pretty cool applications for Netflix studios in React and TypeScript. Today, I want to share with you a little bit about my life experiences with learning different languages as someone who grew up in the United States. I was born in the state of Colorado, where I learned English as a first language. I'm also half Chinese, so from a young age, I learned Mandarin. This is a photo of me at Chinese school where my grandpa was the principal and I went every Sunday for many years. Oh gosh. Then when I got to grade 6, I got braces, but I also got to pick a language to learn in school. I picked Spanish, so from grades 6 to 12, I studied Spanish and I was pretty fluent by the end of it. Something that I've noticed throughout my life, a couple things. One, I don't have to have bangs. Learned that. Two, learning languages is hard. I recently heard that Belgium has 3 official languages, and some of you might speak all 3 and maybe even more, which I find incredibly impressive because this is me now, here, also here. I'm many years removed from grade 12, and to be honest, I've lost most of my Chinese and Spanish skills. I can understand them both well, but speaking, writing, reading, I'm not good. And I've just noticed that maintaining languages after you learn them, also pretty hard. I don't have that many opportunities as an adult where I am to use those skills. So they kind of just got stored in this back part of my brain. I know it's still there, but I can't reach it as easily. And as I do as a software engineer, I draw parallels between my life and my code because that is a totally normal thing to stay up at night thinking about. Well, throughout my career, I've worked for a couple different companies. Most of them were international. And I've worked on apps that have to support multiple languages and locales. I started thinking about how it should be easier to teach our apps to speak different languages than it is to teach our brains, or at least my brain. And maybe there's a way we can architect our React apps such that adding and maintaining new languages and locales doesn't have to be so bad. So before we explore this idea, I want to level set on some vocabulary. The first term that you might have seen around is internationalization, or I-18N. The abbreviation is such that there are 18 characters between the I and the N in the word internationalization. Now this word is kind of cool because in itself, internationalization has 2 different spellings within English. There's the British spelling and the non-British spelling. And so the word internationalization actually also needs to be localized. So that's kind of fun and confusing. And it can also be confusing because there are many different definitions of internationalization out there. But the way that I like to think about it is that internationalization is the process of architecting your app so that when localization occurs, everything just kind of works as expected. You can drop in different locales and your app just supports them. So then what is localization, or L10N? Localization is actually making the content and experience of your app for a given locale. So internationalization is architecting your app to support localization. Localization is actually making your app work for users in different locales. And there are a bunch of elements of localization. This is by no means an exhaustive list. And different applications are going to have to support some or all of these elements. Things like in language, you're going to need translations. You're going to need to support different language directions. Time and date formatting can vary. Sorting and plural representations are different in different languages. Or maybe you have an application that supports currency and you have to be able to format, process, and convert different currencies in different locales. Or maybe your application has lots of symbols and graphics, things like icons, colors, images. You have to think about how these graphics are going to be interpreted for different cultures and what those things are going to say for different users around the world. And then there are things like legal requirements. GDPR is a pretty good example that most people have probably heard of, but there are other privacy laws, data handling laws that you have to be aware of when you're serving users in different locales. Now, there are some React libraries out there that are pretty popular to help be that internationalization architectural solution. So if you do have to support internationalization, I would recommend looking into one of these to see if they fit your needs. But for this talk, I thought it would be more fun to try to build some of it ourselves and take a look at what that architecture might look like and maybe even learn something new. To help me demonstrate, I made a completely fake web application called Sunset Central. You can tell that I really miss traveling because Sunset Central is a place where you can go and watch live streams of sunsets across the world. I was really looking into visiting Brussels for the first time for this talk, but that unfortunately didn't happen. So if you have any nice sunset pictures of Brussels or other places in Belgium, tweet them at me, at Daria Caraway, so that I can take like a little virtual trip through everyone's sunset photos. I think that would be nice. On Sunset Central, you can do a similar thing. You can filter by the type of sunset you want to see. Mountain, maybe beach. I grew up near the mountains, so I really like beach sunsets. And you can see a list of sunsets that are happening at what time, and so that you know when to come back to watch those sunsets. Okay, in my totally made up universe, a lot of other people must be missing traveling because Sunset Central is gaining popularity in different markets across the globe. Looking at their metrics and their feedback, they've decided that they want to target two regions, Spanish speakers in Spain and Arabic speakers in Egypt. So Sunset Central put together a team of translation and locale specialists because oftentimes the developers working on a project won't be language experts. I am definitely not a language expert. The locale specialists have identified two locales that represent Spanish speakers in Spain and Arabic speakers in Egypt. Now, there are multiple different pieces to a locale string. You can see them here: language, script, country, variant, which represents a specific dialect of a language, and extension, which includes different calendar and numeric systems. Oftentimes, you might just see one or two of these pieces of a locale. Sunset Central has decided to just support the language and country parts of these locales. So we have ESES, which is Spanish, the language in Spain, and then we have AREG, which is Arabic in Egypt. With this information, the devs get started on their internationalization work so that they can just kind of like drop in these different locales. Now, what exactly does this page even need to support internationalization-wise? First thing I notice is the language. We're gonna have to support rendering text and strings in multiple languages. Second thing is the dates. These dates are in the US format of month, day, year with a 12-hour clock. Probably not super useful and potentially really confusing to people outside of the US, so we're gonna have to do something about that. And lastly, Sunset Central is going to need to support bidirectional languages or bidirectionality, and I'll explain more on that in a second. So overall, these are the things we're looking at. We're going to keep these in mind: text translations, date formatting, and language direction. Okay, so the devs and the translation team decided that it would be the most helpful if they structured the strings for their app kind of like this. You have a key that represents what a string is trying to communicate, and then different versions of that string for your different languages or locales. Depending on your app, you might store these on the client or somewhere in the back end, but that's kind of up to you. And what do you do with these strings? Well, theoretically, any component in our application is going to render a string. So it's going to need access to these translations. So I think that makes sense to put them in a context. Here I've created a translation context. It stores the current language and that map of translations. It returns a translate function so that any component can take that translate function, and that function will use the key to look up the string for the current language. Then I just created a custom plain use translate hook that gives you access to that translate function. Then we can use that hook to get the translate function in our component, and any string we have to render, we can go ahead and run that key through our translate function to get the localized string. Now, when the locale team is ready to provide translations, the app will just work. This is what it would look like if we set the locale to Spanish in Spain. And it's already looking pretty good. Like most of the page is just properly translated, and most of the page is looking pretty good for that locale. But there's something funky with these dates. So like I said, these are American dates and probably not very familiar or helpful for a Spanish speaker in Spain. So let's fix that. Now, there are a couple of date formatting libraries out there that support localization. First one, not actually a library, the native JavaScript Intl or international object. It has a bunch of different utilities for localization and a couple specifically for date times that are really handy. Now, some of us might know that JavaScript dates aren't the easiest thing to work with. So maybe you're using a date library, and there are quite a few that support localization like Luxin or DateFNs. Sunset Central doesn't have to do much date math or like time zone things. So we're just going to use the JavaScript native Intl object. Right now, the timestamp just gets returned from the server, and we just need to render it in the user's current time zone, which is what the browser does. So with the international or Intl object, we can new up a date time format, pass it our current locale, as well as some options of how we want our date to be formatted. So I have year, month, day, hour, minute, all as numeric values. Then we can call format with our new date. And like magic, the dates are now correctly localized for Spanish speakers in Spain. We now have day, month, year, and a 24-hour clock, which is pretty sweet because it wasn't a ton of code and our dates are already looking more familiar for that locale. Now that Spanish looks good, we've built support for translations and dates. I want to take a look at Arabic. So because of our work that we've done, the text is properly translated and the dates are looking nice, but it's not quite right. And if you speak Arabic, this probably looks completely wrong. And that's because Arabic is a right to left language. So in English, you start on the left, you type words to the right, you read left to right, and you follow page content from left to right. But in Arabic, you start on the right and you type to the left and you read page content from right to left as well. Which means that it isn't just text that needs to be flipped. We also need to flip the page layout, because if you want the user to read from sidebar into content, we're going to need to flip it so that the sidebar is on the right and the content to the left. There are a couple of handy things we can do to make this happen. So the first is to set the direction property on all of our elements that we want to flip, or potentially the whole page. This will flip any non-direction specific content, non-x-axis specific content, things like text or flexbox or CSS grid containers. So if you have a row in a flex container and you set the direction to RTL, it will automatically flip such that the flex container goes from right to left. Okay, so the CSS direction flips any non-direction specific content, but we can also use a CSS utility to help us flip any direction specific content. And by that, I mean anything that specifies a direction on the x-axis, like padding, right, border, left, margin, right, things like that. Because if you have some text in English and you have padding to the right of that text, when you go to flip that text, you're gonna want the padding to be on the left so that the page flow stays the same. There are a couple different CSS utilities out there, depending on what kind of CSS you're working with. One tool that I have used is the RTL CSS JS utility by Kent C. Dodds. Highly recommend. It works with CSS objects. So this utility will take any CSS object and flip all of the direction specific properties for you and output that transformed CSS object, which is pretty cool. Here's how we might use it. The first thing, we need to be able to access the direction. So I made a theme context that stores the content direction. Theme contexts are used often to store themes, like if you have a light mode or a dark mode. If you use a design system like Material UI, you'll also set the direction in that theme in a similar way. In this context, I stored the direction, and then I also made a hook that gives you easy access to the direction in that theme. Then I made one more custom hook called use styles. Use styles returns a function, apply styles, that runs a given CSS object through that RTL CSS JS utility if the direction is RTL. So then in our component, we can grab that apply styles function, run all of our CSS objects through apply styles before handing that object to Emotion to actually render the CSS in the page. So by the time we hand the object to Emotion, all of the direction specific CSS has been flipped with our utility in the hook. So now, if we set the locale to Arabic in Egypt, and we set the direction to right to left, the Sunset Central app is looking a lot better. We have translated strings, localized dates, and bidirectional format, which is pretty cool because we did it in really not that much code, and you can see how dramatically it handles localization for these different locales. So if we look back on that definition of how I interpreted internationalization, which is the process of architecting your app so that when localization occurs, things work as expected, I think we've met our goal because now Sunset Central can take as many localizations as the translations team has ready, drop them in to the app, change the various different pieces of those contexts, and the application will just be localized. I think that's pretty cool. And so in my life, I've learned that learning and maintaining languages, it's hard. It's hard for me, especially as I get older. But I hope that in this short talk, you've learned that architecting your React application to support multiple languages and locales doesn't have to be so hard. Thank you so much. I hope you have an amazing time at the rest of the conference. Please don't forget to tweet me your sunset pictures because I think that would be wonderful. And I have a list of resources that I've compiled for internationalization and localization at this link. Feel free to come by to the Q&A to chat with me and ask questions. And hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.